They called me a relic at my own daughter's dinner table. They said it in Italian, low and comfortable, the way people talk when they're certain no one else in the room understands a word. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about a lot of things since the moment my son-in-law first shook my hand and decided, in the space of that handshake, exactly what kind of man I was. I am 67 years old. I retired 4 years ago after 31 years as a corporate attorney. I live alone now in the house where my daughter grew up, a craftsman bungalow in Asheville with a wide porch and a yard that takes me most of a Saturday morning to mow. My wife, Carol, passed 8 years ago, breast cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I sold the bigger house we'd had in Charlotte and moved somewhere quieter. I planted a vegetable garden in the back. I learned to cook properly for the first time in my life. I read more than I ever had before. I drove up to Vermont one autumn just to see the leaves, something Carol had always wanted us to do, and I sat by a lake for 3 days and felt something close to peace. My daughter called me every Sunday. That had never changed. Even after she married Marcus and moved into their house in the Biltmore Forest neighborhood, the kind of address people say slowly so you hear it, she called every Sunday at 10. We talked for an hour, sometimes longer. She told me about her week, her work, the garden she was trying to grow, and the narrow strip of yard that their landscaper kept too manicured for vegetables. I told her about mine. That was enough. That was everything. I want to be fair about Marcus, so I will say this. He was not a stupid man. He was handsome in a careful way, always dressed like he was aware someone might be photographing him. He worked in commercial real estate development. His family's company, Fortunato Group, had been building mixed-use projects across the Southeast for 20 years. His father had started the business. Marcus had grown up inside it, had been handed a vice president title at 28, and genuinely believed that this sequence of events was the result of his own exceptional quality. That belief was his most dangerous feature. He treated me with a very specific kind of politeness, the kind that has contempt folded inside it like a note in an envelope. He pulled out chairs and refreshed drinks and asked about my garden with his eyebrows lifted just slightly too high, as though my answer, whatever it was, would confirm something he'd already decided. He called me sir in a way that didn't mean respect. He called me sir the way some people say, bless your heart. I noticed. I always noticed. But I had learned, over 31 years of sitting across conference tables from men far more practiced at condescension than Marcus Fortunato, that the most powerful thing you can do in a room is let someone believe their performance is working. So I let him believe. The dinner was in late October. My daughter had been planning it for weeks, a proper sit-down meal at their house, his parents driving up from their primary residence in Charleston. She wanted everyone to feel like family. She had called me twice that week to talk through the menu, the seating, whether she should use the good china or if that felt like trying too hard. I told her whatever she chose would be beautiful, because it would be, because everything she did was done with her mother's care and her own quiet determination, and I was proud of her every day. I arrived at 6:30. Marcus answered the door in a linen shirt, a glass of red wine already in hand, and introduced me to his parents with the particular brightness people use when they are performing warmth rather than feeling it. His father, I will call him my son-in-law's father, because that is what he was to me. Nothing more, was a large man in his early 70s, silver-haired, wearing a blazer over an open collar. He had the build of someone who had worked physically when young, and then stopped and let the mass settle. His handshake was the kind meant to establish something. His wife was elegantly dressed, thin in the way of women who have always treated food as a negotiation rather than a pleasure. She kissed my daughter on both cheeks and said her home was lovely with the faint surprise of someone who had expected less. We sat in the living room for cocktails. The conversation moved the way it always moves in rooms where people are sizing each other up, who went to school where, who knew whom, what various properties were worth. My son-in-law's father mentioned 3 times, in different configurations, that the Fortunato Group had just broken ground on a $52 million development in Greenville. My son-in-law mentioned that their firm was being courted by investors in Atlanta. His mother mentioned the house they were considering in Nantucket. I mentioned that my tomatoes had done exceptionally well this year, that I'd put up 14 jars of sauce, and that I was considering expanding the raised beds in spring. The look my son-in-law's father gave his wife lasted less than a second. I caught it completely. We moved to the table at 7:30. My daughter had said it beautifully: candles, flowers from the market, linen napkins. She'd pressed herself. She came out of the kitchen carrying a roasted chicken on a platter, and she looked so much like her mother in that moment that I had to look down at my water glass for a beat. The wine was poured. My son-in-law's mother said something to her husband in Italian, quietly, not directed at the table. She was looking at the centerpiece when she said it. I understood every word. She said the flowers were from a grocery store, and that you could always tell. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip and said nothing. The wine was good. My daughter had chosen it. Now, I need to explain something, because my daughter did not know this about me, not fully. She knew I had lived abroad when I was young. She knew I had spent time in Europe, but I had never made a point of it, and she had never asked the right question, and so we had arrived at the particular situation where a man can speak a language fluently for 43 years without his own child knowing. I had spent 2 years in Milan in my early 20s, between undergraduate and law school, working as a translator for a small international firm. 2 years becomes 3 years if the city is beautiful enough and you are 23 and the food is extraordinary and a woman with dark eyes teaches you that a language is not truly learned until you dream in it. I dreamed in Italian for almost a decade after I came home. The woman eventually married someone else. The Italian stayed. 43 years. I had used it in depositions twice, in contract negotiations perhaps a dozen times, at conferences in Rome and Florence, and once in a small restaurant in Bologna, where the owner came out of the kitchen when he heard me order and stood there with his arms crossed and a broad smile and said my accent was almost forgivable for an American. I had never had a reason to mention any of this to Marcus. He had never asked me a question about my life that he actually wanted the answer to. The dinner moved through its courses. My daughter's chicken was perfect. My son-in-law complimented it and immediately pivoted to a story about a restaurant in Rome he and his mother had eaten at 3 years prior. The implication being clear, the pivot smooth enough that only someone watching for it would notice. I was watching for it. The Italian came in small doses through the meal, a phrase between his parents, a murmured aside, the particular ease of people code-switching because they believe the code is unbreakable. By the time the second bottle of wine was opened, they had grown more comfortable, more certain. His father made a comment to his wife about the neighborhood my daughter and son-in-law lived in. He said it was nice enough, but it wasn't really Biltmore Forest proper, was it? More the edge of it, and what Marcus paid for the house, he probably could have done better if he'd used the family's broker. His mother laughed softly and agreed and then said something about my daughter's china, that it was mismatched, that she could see 2 different patterns on the table. It was one pattern. The candlelight made 2 of the plates look slightly different from across the table. My daughter had spent 3 Saturdays finding that set at estate sales, piece by piece, because her mother had loved that particular pattern, and the full set was impossible to find anymore. I set my fork down very carefully. I looked across the table at my daughter, who was refilling her son-in-law's water glass and smiling at something he'd just said, completely unaware of what was being said 4 feet away, in a language she didn't speak. She looked like her mother. I picked my fork back up. I ate the rest of my chicken. I said nothing. After dinner, while the dishes were being cleared, my son-in-law's father and I sat together in the living room. My son-in-law was in the kitchen opening another bottle. His mother had gone with my daughter to see something in the garden, though it was dark outside, which told me she had engineered a moment alone with my daughter that I did not like the shape of. My son-in-law's father leaned back in the armchair across from me with the easy spread of a man who has always fit comfortably in whatever room he occupied. And he said, "Marcus tells me you were a lawyer." "I was," I said. "Corporate side?" "Yes." He nodded in the way that men nod when they are calculating rather than agreeing. "Good living in that. Good living. But you retired young." 63, I said. My wife had passed. The work had changed. It felt like time. He swirled his wine. "Marcus said you live up here in Asheville now. Nice area. Relaxed. Good place to slow down." I looked at him. "It is," I said. He smiled. "I'll be honest with you, man to man. I worry sometimes about Sophie, about what she's walking into with Marcus's career. The development business is cyclical, you know. There are lean years, and Marcus is ambitious, which is great, but ambition without capital is just—" He made a gesture with his hand. You understand. I just want to know she's going to be taken care of, that she has people around her. I held his gaze for a moment. I wanted to see the thing behind the question, and there it was, patient as a kept secret. He was asking me, without asking me, what I was worth, whether I was a resource or a liability, whether my daughter had married into a family that would be pulling or pushing. Sophie is extraordinary, I said. She's always taken care of herself. He chuckled. Of course, of course. Wonderful girl. We love her. My son-in-law came back into the room with the wine. His father switched topics. I listened and said very little for the rest of the evening. I drove home that night with the windows down despite the October chill, the mountain air cold and sharp against my face. And I thought about what I had heard at that table and what I had seen in that living room, and I made some decisions. I had not spent 31 years in corporate law without understanding the mechanics of a position. His father had been assessing me. My son-in-law had been performing. His mother had been cataloging my daughter's home like an appraiser who didn't like what she found. None of this was an accident. None of this was careless. I also understood something else. Something I had observed in courtrooms and boardrooms for 3 decades. People who believe they have already won stop watching. They had already decided what I was. A retired old man in a small house with a vegetable garden, a widower, pleasant enough, negligible. The decision had been made within the first 30 minutes of the first time Marcus brought my daughter home to meet me, and everything since had been filed accordingly. I thought about my daughter pressing those linen napkins. I thought about her driving to 3 different estate sales to find that china pattern piece by piece. I got home. I poured a small glass of bourbon. I sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the neighborhood settle into night, and I thought very carefully about what came next. Not out of anger. I had aged out of decisions made from anger a long time ago, out of clarity. The following Monday, I called David Reyes. David had been my closest colleague at the firm for 19 years before I retired. He was younger than me by a decade, still practicing, still meticulous, and still the person I trusted most in the legal world. We had lunch every few months. He knew everything about corporate structure and asset protection, and he had told me at my retirement dinner, half joking, half not, that if I ever needed anything to just call, that I had spent 30 years making other people bulletproof, and it was time I let someone do the same for me. I told him I was ready to take him up on that. We met twice over the following 3 weeks. The second meeting included a financial advisor I had worked with for years. We put together something that had been on my to-do list for a long time and that I had simply never found the urgency to complete. A trust, structured precisely, detailed in its protections, covering the assets I had built quietly over 30 years of careful work and careful saving. A trust that named my daughter as beneficiary in terms that were thorough and clean and completely outside the reach of anyone who might, someday, see her as a vehicle for their own interests. In the course of those conversations, David mentioned something that I had not known but found interesting. The Fortunato Group had a project currently in litigation, a commercial development in Columbia, South Carolina, where the general contractor was suing over unpaid invoices, and there were some irregularities in how the subcontracting agreements had been structured. It was not my business. I was not involved. But knowledge, in my experience, is weight. You do not always have to use it. You simply have to have it. My daughter called me that Sunday, as always. She sounded tired, the way she sometimes sounds when she is managing something she doesn't want to say directly. I waited. Marcus's mother called me this week, she said finally. Oh? She wanted to have lunch. Just the 2 of us. A pause. She was nice. She was very. Another pause. She asked a lot of questions about your house. Whether you were thinking of selling, whether you needed help with things. Help with things, I repeated. She framed it like she was worried, like she wanted to make sure you were comfortable. My daughter's voice had gone careful in the way it goes careful when she is choosing not to say what she actually thinks. She also mentioned, and this is going to sound strange, that Marcus has been talking about looking into some investment opportunities, and that it might be nice if family could be part of that. If anyone wanted to be part of it. I was quiet for a moment. The birds were loud in the yard. The morning was bright and cold. Sophie? I said. Yeah, Dad. I'd like to come for dinner next Saturday, if that's all right. Of course, she said. Is everything okay? Everything is fine, I said. I just have a few things I want to share with you, and I'd like Marcus to be there. She came to pick me up, which she insisted on, and on the drive over she kept glancing at me in that sideways way she'd had since she was 12 years old when she was trying to read something in my face. I kept my face neutral. I asked about her week. I asked about the garden. I told her I'd brought a bottle of wine. Marcus was in the kitchen when we arrived. He greeted me warmly, perhaps more warmly than usual, which told me his mother had called him after their lunch with my daughter. I shook his hand and smiled and said the house smelled wonderful. We ate pasta my daughter had made from scratch, a green salad, good bread. The conversation was easy on the surface. Marcus mentioned the Greenville project. I asked a few questions, specific questions, the kind that have a shape to them, the kind that an old man who doesn't understand commercial real estate would not think to ask. I watched something flicker behind his eyes when I asked them. Not alarm. Not yet. Just recalibration. He had been operating on a particular assumption about me, and the questions didn't fit. After dinner, when my daughter was making coffee, Marcus and I sat in the living room and he angled into it smooth, practiced, almost good. He talked about family and investment, and the way smart money moved in cycles, and how sometimes the best opportunities were ones shared among people who trusted each other. He talked about a project in Tennessee, how they needed a few additional investors, how it was a limited window. He was still talking when my daughter came in with the coffee. She set down the cups and looked at us. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and I took out 2 envelopes. I placed them on the coffee table. I went to see David Reyes a few weeks ago, I said. David was my colleague for 19 years, best contracts attorney I've ever known. I slid the larger envelope toward my daughter. That's a copy of the trust documentation. David will walk you through everything. But the short version is that your assets, and eventually mine, which are more substantial than I've made a point of discussing, are protected. Structured properly. Insulated. I met her eyes. You're taken care of, Sophie. That's done. That's finished. She looked at the envelope, then at me. The room was very quiet. I picked up the second envelope. I held it without opening it. I also want to be clear about something, I said. I am not interested in investing in the Fortunato Group's Tennessee project, or any other project. I set the envelope back down, not because I couldn't, but because the structure of what you've described has some features I'd want to understand better before I ever put my name on anything near it. And I'm the kind of person who reads the fine print. Marcus had not moved. He was looking at me the way I had seen men look in depositions when they realize the other side has more than they showed. I've been a corporate attorney for 31 years, Marcus, I said. Before that, I spent 2 years in Milan working as a legal translator. I speak Italian fluently. I always have. I kept my voice level and warm. I smiled. I want you to know that. I should have mentioned it sooner. It simply never came up. The color moved through his face in a slow wave. I watched him understand, backward from that sentence, through the dinner, through the Italian, through every quiet comment his parents had made at my daughter's table. I watched him reconstruct the evening with a new piece of information in place, like a building whose foundation has just shifted. My daughter was looking at her husband. I am not a man who enjoys watching someone suffer. I want to be clear about that. What I felt in that moment was not satisfaction at his discomfort. It was something more complicated. It was the feeling of a thing being set right, of a boundary drawn cleanly, of the kind of honest accounting that keeps relationships from rotting quietly from the inside. Dad, my daughter said. Her voice was low. I love you, I said, and you have never needed protecting from me. But I wanted you to know, clearly, exactly where you stand, and where I stand, and that the two are not in any way unclear. She was very still. Then she stood up and came around the coffee table and put her arms around me, and I held on to her for a moment and smelled her hair and thought about her mother, who would have handled all of this better than I did, and with considerably more grace, and who would have found the exact right words instead of the words I had managed to find. Marcus left the room. He came back 20 minutes later. He was quieter. The performance had come down. What was underneath it was harder to read, but it was more honest, and that was something. He sat down and he said, I want to apologize for my parents and for the things that were said at dinner that shouldn't have been said. I nodded. I didn't know, they said. He stopped. I should have paid more attention. You should have, I agreed. not unkindly, simply accurately. He was quiet for a moment. I think I've had a certain picture of who you were. I think I was wrong about it. You were, I said. Another silence. Can I ask the trust? The assets. I'm not asking for any reason, except how did you? 31 years, I said. I worked. I saved. I invested quietly, and I made good decisions, and I didn't spend money performing a life I didn't have yet. I looked at him steadily. Real wealth is usually quieter than people expect. The people who announce it the most tend to have the least of it that's actually theirs. He looked like he'd been handed something he wasn't sure how to hold. Good. Sometimes that discomfort is the beginning of something better. My daughter drove me home that night. For the first few minutes of the drive, neither of us spoke. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and the town lights fell away behind us as we climbed toward my neighborhood. You knew, she said. At the dinner. You knew everything they were saying. I did, and you just sat there. I ate my chicken, which was excellent, by the way. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then it became something else for a moment. She pressed her lips together and looked at the road. The china, she said. Did they? Don't worry about that. Dad. Sophie. I kept my voice gentle. You made a beautiful dinner. Your mother would have loved that table. She was quiet for a long time after that. When she pulled up in front of my house, she put the car in park and sat there with the engine running and said, I didn't know about the trust. I didn't know any of that was. I didn't realize. You weren't supposed to carry it, I said. That was mine to carry. Are you okay? Living here alone all this time, are you actually okay? I thought about the vegetable garden and the wide porch and the drive to Vermont in autumn. I thought about the mornings that are difficult and the evenings that are not. I thought about Carol. Always. The way you think about someone who was the best of your life. Not as a wound, not anymore, but as a room you carry inside you that will always be warm. I'm more than okay, I said. And I meant it. She walked me to the door. She hugged me at the threshold the way she used to when she was young, and I was dropping her off somewhere she wasn't entirely sure about. I watched her taillights move down the street until they were gone. I went inside. I poured a glass of water. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the house, which is a different kind of quiet than loneliness, a chosen quiet, an earned quiet, the quiet of a life that is not large in the way people who announce themselves consider large, but is solid and true and entirely mine. The trust was filed. The documentation was cleaned. My daughter had read the envelope on the drive home. I had seen her pull it out at a red light, just one page, just the summary, and fold it back carefully and put it in her bag with both hands. She was protected. That was done. The next morning, I was up early, which I always am. I made coffee and took it out to the back porch and stood in the gray pre-dawn with the cup warm in both hands, looking at the garden beds that were finished for the season, the soil dark and resting, the stakes still in the ground where the tomatoes had been. In spring, I would expand the beds. I had already drawn out the plan 3 new rows along the back fence, room for peppers and beans and the herbs Carol had always asked for. A few days later, my son-in-law called me directly, which he had never done before. He said his mother wanted to apologize. He said she was embarrassed. He said his father had asked, carefully and without explanation, whether I had ever considered investing in real estate, and Marcus had told him clearly and with unusual firmness that the answer was no and that the subject was closed. I told Marcus I appreciated the call. He paused. Then he said, She talks about you a lot, Sophie. She always has. I think I came in with a story already written, and I didn't. He stopped. I'm sorry. I want to be better about that. That was the most honest thing Marcus had ever said to me. I told him I believed him. I told him my door was open on Sundays if he and my daughter ever wanted to come by for coffee. That I was planning to try a new bread recipe and I needed people to eat it. He said they'd come. My daughter called that Sunday at 10, as always. We talked for an hour. She told me about the garden she was thinking of starting seeds indoors in February. She'd found a book on kitchen gardens and she'd been reading it at night. She asked if I thought it was too ambitious. I told her it wasn't ambitious enough. I told her I'd bring her a better book. I told her there was nothing wrong with starting with more than you think you can manage, because gardens, like most good things, have a way of growing beyond what you initially planned, and that is not a problem, that is the point. She laughed. She sounded like herself. She sounded like her mother. The morning was bright outside my window. The birds were at the feeder I'd put up in the yard last winter. The coffee was good. Some victories do not announce themselves. They don't arrive as confrontations won or arguments settled or rooms where someone finally said what needed to be said out loud. They arrive as mornings ordinary, unhurried mornings where the coffee is ready and the light is clear and the people you love are safe and the quiet of your own house feels like something you built with intention rather than something that simply happened to you. I finished my coffee. I put on my boots and went out to the garden and stood in the thin November sun with my hands in my pockets, looking at the beds, thinking about spring.